Grandpa arrives at the funeral but is confronted with blatant racism. The atmosphere is tense. Every gaze and whisper magnifies the injustice, setting up the story's emotional and cinematic tone. "We don't allow people like you here," the receptionist barked, her voice slicing through the solemn hum of the chapel like a jagged knife. Grandpa froze for a heartbeat, letting the words sink in. He adjusted the sleeve of his worn black suit, straightened the crease in his slacks, and inhaled deeply. His eyes scanned the room beyond the entrance. Towering oak walls polished to a dull shine, candles flickering in brass holders, and mourners dressed in somber black, their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, faces tight with grief or judgment. The chapel smelled of polished wood, wax, and faint perfume, mingling with the scent of wet earth from the freshly dug grave outside. Grandpa's cane tapped once against the marble floor, a soft but deliberate sound that echoed in the hush, drawing startled glances from the few mourners near the entrance. A young usher stepped forward, lips pressed tight, trying to mask the unease in his eyes. "Sir, this is a private service," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Grandpa didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted his chin, his calm presence radiating a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with the woman's sharp hostility. "I am here to honor the departed," he said, voice steady, resonant, carrying across the room. "And no one's prejudice will dictate my presence." The receptionist's face turned red with indignation, her mouth opening as if to spit another insult, but she faltered under the weight of his gaze. Every fiber of Grandpa's being exuded dignity. His eyes, deep and steady, scanned the room. He noticed the murmurs rising among the gathered mourners, subtle shifts in posture, hurried whispers behind gloved hands, a few stifled gasps. Each glance and whisper added to the cinematic tension, painting the room with the heavy brush of societal bias. Slowly, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit coat and withdrew a folded hymn sheet, letting it drift gently to the floor. The paper twirled like a white feather in a breeze before landing softly at the receptionist's polished shoes. Heads turned, eyes widened, and for a fleeting moment, the room held its collective breath. Even the preacher, mid-sermon, paused, brow furrowing as his gaze met Grandpa's. A ripple of unease moved among the officiants and mourners alike. Grandpa's hand rested lightly on his cane as he took measured steps forward, each tap resonating in rhythm with his heartbeat. The quiet strength of his movements spoke louder than words. He could feel the judgment pressing against him, a silent barrier of entitlement that some had built around him, yet he remained unshaken. "Respect," he said, voice carrying like a soft thunder, "is not a privilege. It is earned by the heart, not denied by ignorance." A few mourners flinched at the weight of his words. Others exchanged glances, uncertain how to respond. The woman at the entrance gritted her teeth, unable to tear her eyes away from his poised figure. The tension between arrogance and dignity hung thick in the air, almost visible, like smoke curling toward the ceiling. Grandpa's presence became a focal point. Every detail, the worn scuff on his shoes, the slight tremor in his fingers, the resolute lift of his chin told a story of decades weathered against injustice. The room itself seemed to acknowledge him, shadows of the chandeliers stretching toward him as if bending to his silent command, flickering candle flames dancing with anticipation. He moved closer to the front, weaving carefully between rows of pews, and offered polite nods to a few curious faces, never breaking eye contact with those who tried to intimidate him. The young usher, visibly torn between duty and discomfort, stepped aside, letting him pass. The murmurs grew softer, replaced by a tense silence. Thick with expectation at the altar, the preacher's voice broke the stillness, but his words lacked conviction as his eyes lingered on Grandpa. The man had arrived as an intruder in their eyes, yet carried the aura of someone whose presence demanded acknowledgement. Grandpa's gaze swept over the chapel one last time, every frown, every sideways glance, every flicker of doubt. Then, as he took his place near the front, he let a faint, almost imperceptible smile grace his lips. This was not merely an entry. It was a declaration. The first act of quiet rebellion had begun. The audience, unaware of the storm to come, waited, hearts tightening. Grandpa's calm defiance was a prelude to the unraveling of arrogance that would follow, a cinematic tension poised on the edge of revelation. The stage was set, and every whisper in the hall would soon tremble in the wake of what was about to unfold. The room seemed to contract around him, every whisper a sharp pinprick of tension. As Grandpa moved toward the front, the faint rustle of his coat and the measured tap of his cane drew attention. Eyes followed him, some curious, some cold, others heavy with unspoken judgment. It was not just his presence, but the calm dignity he carried, that unnerved them. A mother clutched her child tightly, glancing nervously at him. "Why is he here?" she whispered, her voice laced with unease. Her husband leaned closer, pretending to examine the program, yet his eyes betrayed him. Grandpa overheard just enough. He didn't react. He didn't need to. His silent awareness was a force of its own, a quiet power that drew the room's energy into a tense coil. The pews were polished oak, gleaming under the soft flicker of candlelight, reflecting the faces of those who judged without speaking. A group of men in dark suits whispered among themselves, nodding subtly, exchanging furtive glances. Their conversation was inaudible to most, but the weight of their disdain pressed against Grandpa's shoulders like a tangible force. He stepped carefully, not rushing, letting each movement mark a subtle statement of presence. One of the young ushers, standing awkwardly by the side aisle, shifted nervously, unsure whether to intervene or stand aside. Grandpa's eyes caught his hesitation, and he gave a faint, reassuring nod. The boy relaxed slightly, realizing this man was not just unbothered by the tension he commanded at the front. The preacher's voice rose again, a soft monotone of ritual words that seemed to barely mask the growing unease. He glanced at Grandpa repeatedly, each time with a flicker of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that this was no ordinary guest. Grandpa's presence was a question mark in a room built on expectation and hierarchy, an interruption in the carefully choreographed performance of grief. The congregation's whispers grew, more audacious now. A woman near the aisle shook her head subtly, murmuring to her neighbor, "He shouldn't be here." Her voice carried a threat of fear, perhaps of social repercussion, perhaps of the realization that her certainty was being challenged. Grandpa's gaze met hers briefly, steady and calm, and the tension between them stretched, taut, almost unbearable. He reached into his coat again, producing a small, worn handkerchief, and unfolded it with precise movements, letting it brush his fingers like a soft, deliberate gesture. He didn't wave it at anyone. It was not a show of defiance, but a quiet symbol of presence, of humanity, of dignity in the face of judgment. The whispering subsided slightly, replaced by staring, the kind of scrutiny that weighs heavily without a word. Grandpa's mind wandered briefly, not in thought of revenge, but reflection. He remembered other days when prejudice had tried to push him aside, when doors had slammed, opportunities denied, voices silenced. But here, today, he would not be silent. He would not shrink. The chapel, with its polished floors and whispered judgments, was the stage on which his quiet rebellion would unfold. The preacher began a hymn, soft chords filling the hall. Grandpa joined with a low, steady hum, not loud, not demanding attention, but unmistakable in its presence. Some faces stiffened. Some stared, mouths slightly open. Others, unsure of what they were seeing, glanced at one another. Grandpa's calm melody floated above the tension, a contrast to the murmur of whispers and shifting feet. He noticed the young boy usher watching him closely, eyes wide with curiosity and unspoken admiration. Grandpa offered a brief, subtle smile. The child's nervous energy eased. He straightened, as if absorbing some of the older man's quiet courage. Even in small ways, influence radiated outward from Grandpa, touching others, unsettling those built on arrogance and entitlement. As the hymn ended, the preacher prepared to speak, and a hush fell across the room. Every eye flickered back to Grandpa, some with suspicion, some with disbelief. The stage had been set, the tension thickened. The whispers, the glances, the silent judgments, all of it coalesced around him. He stood, not moving, not flinching, the calm center in a storm of unease. In that charged silence, the first hint of change shimmered, fragile and invisible to many, but undeniable. The congregation didn't yet know that the ripple Grandpa created would soon swell into a tidal wave of revelation, humility, and shock. Every whisper and glance in that chapel was a thread in the web that would unravel around arrogance and entitlement. Grandpa took a steady breath, feeling the energy of the room, aware of the power of patience and dignity. The first act had ended with quiet tension. The second act, with whispers and stares, had begun. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the moment when the room would truly tremble was approaching, its timing perfect, inevitable. The chapel seemed to shrink with each passing moment, walls pressing closer as eyes followed every deliberate movement Grandpa made. Even the flickering candlelight seemed to lean toward him, illuminating the contours of his calm, weathered face. Every step he took was measured, precise, deliberate, a silent declaration that he belonged as much as anyone. Despite the stifling judgment around him, murmurs had evolved into pointed glances. A cluster of women near the back whispered with subtle urgency, fingers lightly tapping hymn books, eyes darting to him as though afraid the very act of his presence would disrupt their carefully curated world. Grandpa noticed, not with anger, but with an unwavering acknowledgement of their discomfort. He carried no hostility, only quiet resilience, and that, more than anything, made the room restless. A man in a tailored gray suit leaned over his wife, murmuring, "He shouldn't be here. Look at him." His words were meant to cut, to assert superiority, but Grandpa didn't flinch. Instead, his gaze met the man's for a brief, steady moment, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. In that silence, the man's certainty wavered, though he would never admit it aloud. The chapel was a battlefield of unspoken hierarchies, and Grandpa's presence challenged every unchallenged assumption. Grandpa's cane tapped lightly against the polished floor as he moved slowly to find a seat near the front. The tap was rhythmic, almost musical, drawing attention not through volume but through presence. Each echo seemed to press the arrogance of the room against the walls, subtly, undeniably. A few mourners shuffled uneasily, whispering to one another, trying to regain control over the situation. But the control was no longer theirs, it had quietly shifted. Near the front, a young woman with tightly coiled hair and nervous eyes tried to avoid eye contact, yet curiosity betrayed her. She watched as Grandpa adjusted his coat and smoothed the creases in his shirt, every small gesture speaking of decades of endurance, of navigating a world that often underestimated him. There was a dignity in his calm movements, a silent language that conveyed resilience without a single raised voice. The preacher began to read aloud from the scripture, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension, his eyes flicking to Grandpa periodically. It was clear even to him that this was no ordinary guest. The preacher's tone wavered subtly, words slightly clipped, a ritual interrupted by presence. Grandpa listened silently, nodding at times, letting the weight of the moment settle into his bones. He was not merely attending a funeral, he was participating in a subtle challenge. To every biased assumption in the room behind him, a young boy fiddled with the hem of his sleeve, whispering to his mother, Why is he here? His mother shushed him, but the curiosity lingered in his eyes. Grandpa caught the faintest glance from the boy, offering a gentle nod and a warm, reassuring smile. That small act of connection, unnoticed by many, planted seeds of understanding that arrogance and prejudice could not erase. Every glance cast in his direction became heavier, sharper. The room's air, heavy with incense and flowers, now carried the almost tangible weight of judgment. People shifted in their seats, adjusting posture, fidgeting with programs, avoiding eye contact but never fully ignoring him. Grandpa remained still, a calm island amid a storm of whispered doubts and suppressed disdain. His eyes, deep and unwavering, carried centuries of experience, the knowledge that arrogance could be unmasked, that dignity was its own shield. He reached into his pocket and produced a small, leather-bound book worn with age and care. Opening it with deliberate slowness, he ran his fingers over the pages, a subtle act of self-possession, a quiet assertion of identity. Each movement resonated silently through the room, marking him as someone who existed beyond the narrow constraints of prejudice. Even the ushers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that nothing in their protocol could diminish the strength of his presence. As the preacher's words continued, Grandpa lifted his voice in a gentle, controlled hum of the hymn, joining the choir without seeking attention. His tone was soft but unmistakable, adding a layer of humanity and emotion that the room could not ignore. Faces turned, some in surprise, some in quiet acknowledgment, and a few with the faint stirrings of guilt. The arrogance that had so confidently filled the space now trembled. Fragile and uncertain. By the time the first verse concluded, Grandpa had subtly shifted the energy of the entire chapel. The whispered judgments, the tight-lipped stares, the silent superiority, they all hung precariously, balanced on the edge of exposure. Grandpa remained calm, seated near the front, his posture straight, his eyes clear, every breath measured. He was a quiet force of dignity, waiting for the right moment to reveal the depth of his story and the power of his presence. The stage was set. The whispers, the stares, the tension, all threads of a larger tapestry about to unravel. And somewhere deep inside, Grandpa knew that every glance cast at him, every whispered word, was part of the prelude to the revelation that would shake the room to its core. The room was thick with unspoken tension, a heavy silence punctuated by the occasional shuffle of a foot or rustle of clothing. Grandpa remained seated near the front, his cane resting against his knee, hands folded lightly over it. Every detail of his appearance spoke of years of resilience, the polished but worn shoes, the subtle wrinkles in his suit, the steady gaze that carried decades of experience and unspoken wisdom. Around him, whispers had begun to spread, less audible now, more like currents under the surface of the crowd. People leaned closer to one another, voices hushed, eyes darting repeatedly toward Grandpa. Some faces were tight with indignation, others with the first glimmers of doubt, and a few betrayed a curious admiration they would never voice aloud. The chapel's polished oak walls reflected candlelight that shimmered across the floor, illuminating the silent struggle of unacknowledged power. A young woman sitting a few rows back fidgeted, with a lace on her gloves. She stole a glance at Grandpa, her brow furrowing. Her mother nudged her, whispering, "Focus on the service." Yet the girl's eyes could not leave him. She was captivated, not by flamboyance or loud words, but by the stillness of a man who commanded respect without demanding it. Grandpa's presence alone unsettled her understanding of who belonged in a place of privilege. At the front, the preacher hesitated, voice cracking slightly as he read the next passage. The ceremonial cadence faltered under the weight of observation. Grandpa's calm gaze met the preacher's briefly, and a flicker of uncertainty crossed the man's face. He was reminded that dignity and humanity could not be legislated or dictated by social convention. A subtle unease took root in the room, unnoticed by many, yet undeniable. Murmurs began to weave through the congregation again, this time tinged with confusion. "Who is he?" one woman whispered, her voice trembling slightly. How is he here?" Another shook her head, trying to mask the shock in her eyes. Grandpa did not react outwardly. His composure was a shield and a message in itself. In the quiet strength of his posture, there was a lesson that could not be ignored. He slowly rose from his seat, cane in hand, each movement deliberate and measured. The tap against the polished floor echoed softly, a metronome of resilience. Heads turned more sharply now. The whispers grew quieter, replaced by the tangible weight of scrutiny. It was as if the chapel itself had paused to measure his presence, a collective intake of breath hanging heavy in the air. Grandpa's eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on every pair of judgmental eyes, every sneer veiled as polite observation. A group of men near the aisle shifted uneasily, exchanging silent glances, unsure how to assert authority against the quiet power radiating from a man who had faced far greater challenges in his lifetime. Every instinct of social hierarchy faltered. Subtle arrogance wavered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded handkerchief, worn and frayed from decades of use. He unfolded it with care, letting it rest lightly in his hand. It was not a gesture meant for attention, yet it carried symbolic weight, the mark of a life lived with dignity and grace, a life that could not be diminished by the fleeting judgments of the unprepared. As he continued to move toward the front, a few young children glanced at him curiously, whispering among themselves. Grandpa offered them a gentle nod, acknowledging their presence. The innocence of their gaze contrasted with the cynicism of the adults, foreshadowing the shift that would come when truth was revealed. Even in these small interactions, influence radiated quietly, reshaping perceptions in ways subtle but profound. The preacher cleared his throat and began a sermon, his words more tentative now, lacking the confident cadence of earlier. Grandpa stood near the front, hands lightly gripping his cane, a calm presence against the undercurrent of tension. His steady breathing, the small adjustments of his posture, and the unwavering clarity of his gaze communicated authority and dignity far stronger than any volume of voice could achieve. The congregation, some consciously, some unconsciously, leaned into his aura of resilience. Whispers of judgment softened, replaced by uneasy contemplation. The arrogance that had seemed so dominant at the start of the service now wavered, shaking under the quiet weight of his presence. Grandpa did not need to confront anyone directly. His simple existence and composed demeanor were enough to challenge assumptions, to stir the first seeds of respect in the hearts of those who had assumed superiority. By the time the hymn resumed, there was a subtle shift in energy. The air, once thick with whispered prejudice, carried now a sense of expectancy. Every person in the room was aware of him in a new light, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, and a few with unspoken admiration. Grandpa's calm had begun to reshape the atmosphere, a prelude to the revelation that would make the room tremble. He lowered his head slightly, letting the candlelight catch the lines of his face. In that quiet motion there was power, wisdom, and unshakable dignity. The stage was set for what would come next, and the whispers of the past were slowly giving way to the anticipation of a truth no one had expected. The soft hum of the hymn had faded, replaced by a brittle silence that seemed to stretch across the chapel. Grandpa remained near the front, standing tall with his cane lightly gripping the polished floor, every movement deliberate, every breath controlled. The room's energy had shifted subtly yet unmistakably. Where once arrogance and entitlement had seemed unchallenged, there was now unease, a fragile tension waiting to snap. Murmurs began to swell again, this time louder, sharper. "Why is he even here?" whispered a woman near the aisle, her voice tremulous. betraying both curiosity and fear of the social consequences of being caught staring. Her husband, equally uncomfortable, kept his eyes fixed on the program, though his jaw tightened with silent judgment. The whispers coalesced into a subtle undercurrent, a low hum of tension weaving through the pews like an invisible thread. Grandpa's gaze swept over the congregation, catching each glance without flinching. His calmness, like a still pond in the middle of a storm, reflected the arrogance of those around him back onto themselves. The polished floors and the flickering candlelight seemed to amplify his presence, casting long shadows that moved with him, almost as if the chapel itself had taken sides. A young boy near the back shifted nervously in his seat, whispering, "Mom? Why is he standing there?" His mother shushed him, but curiosity lingered in his wide eyes. Grandpa noticed the child's gaze, offered a small, reassuring nod, and returned his attention to the front. In that small, silent gesture, he began to dismantle the assumptions of a generation taught to judge by appearance rather than character. The preacher, mid-sermon, coughed softly, his voice betraying a faint tremor. His eyes flicked repeatedly to Grandpa, and each glance carried more uncertainty than the last. The man had arrived expecting a routine service, orderly and predictable. But Grandpa's calm defiance, unassuming yet powerful, had introduced an invisible tension that was beginning to ripple outward, affecting everyone present. Near the back, a group of women leaned toward one another, whispering with a mixture of indignation and disbelief. He doesn't belong here," one murmured, a slight tremor in her voice. Another shook her head, clutching the edge of her purse, realizing that her certainty was being questioned by mere presence. Grandpa did not respond. He did not need to. His very existence in the room spoke louder than any words could. Every step he took, measured and deliberate, echoed softly against the polished floor. His cane tapped a subtle rhythm, each echo a quiet statement of presence and dignity. A man in a dark suit shifted in his seat, unease flickering across his face. He had never encountered someone who carried such calm authority without aggression or confrontation. Grandpa's aura unsettled him, forced him to confront the fragility of the arrogance he had always assumed was unshakable. Grandpa reached into his coat pocket, retrieving a small folded handkerchief. He held it lightly, letting it rest in his hand, a subtle act that drew the eyes of several attendees. It was not an ostentatious gesture. It carried no demand for attention. Yet in that small act, he communicated history, resilience, and quiet strength, a lifetime of dignity condensed into the simplest of motions. Whispers began to intertwine with visible reactions. Hands clutched hymn books tighter. Heads tilted with curiosity or doubt. Some congregants stiffened in their seats, unsure how to reconcile their assumptions with the reality before them. Grandpa's calm, composed demeanor acted as a mirror, reflecting back the discomfort and instability of those who had assumed unquestioned superiority. The preacher attempted to regain control, his voice firming, but the cadence lacked confidence. Each word was weighed down by the tension his congregation now felt. Grandpa's presence, silent yet commanding, had begun to unravel the careful choreography of privilege and entitlement that had gone unnoticed until now. As the service continued, Grandpa quietly hummed the hymn again, soft and low. His tone was gentle, human, deliberate, filling the room with a subtle, undeniable presence. Those who listened closely felt a shift, an unspoken acknowledgement that dignity could not be suppressed by whispers or judgment. Even the most arrogant attendees could not ignore the quiet power radiating from him. By the time the preacher concluded the passage, the atmosphere in the chapel had changed. The whispered judgments had softened into unease, the rigid postures into hesitant curiosity. Grandpa remained composed, seated near the front, eyes steady, aura commanding yet calm. He had subtly shifted the energy, proving that quiet resilience often carried more weight than arrogance and entitlement. The murmurs were no longer mere background noise, they were the first visible cracks in the carefully constructed facade of superiority. Grandpa's presence had begun to unsettle the room in ways that words could not capture, laying the foundation for the revelation that would soon shake everyone to the core. The chapel was silent now, but the silence was not peaceful, it was thick with anticipation, each heartbeat echoing like a drum. Grandpa stood near the front, his hand resting lightly on the worn handle of his cane. Candlelight flickered across the polished pews, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance across the faces of the congregation, highlighting every flicker of doubt, every tightening jaw, every forced polite expression. Eyes followed his every movement, some curious, some sharp with judgment. The whispered comments had grown quieter, but the energy they carried had intensified. Subtle glances darted between attendees as they measured each other's reactions. Grandpa's calmness acted as a magnet, drawing attention without a single word of confrontation. It was in the stillness of his posture, the steady lift of his chin, and the deliberate grace of his movements. Near the back, a woman pressed her fingers into her purse straps, her eyes locked on Grandpa. She murmured to a friend, "I don't understand. He shouldn't be allowed to." Her voice trailed off as doubt crept in. Her friend shook her head slightly, acknowledging the conflict between societal expectation and the undeniable presence before them. The weight of assumptions was shifting imperceptibly. Grandpa adjusted his coat, letting the folds settle just so, and tapped his cane softly on the floor, a rhythmic, almost imperceptible sound. Each tap seemed to resonate through the pews, a subtle punctuation that reminded the congregation of the authority he carried simply by existing in the space. Every whispered glance, every furrowed brow, every forced polite smile was a reaction to a quiet power that could not be denied. The preacher's voice rose again, reading from the scripture, but his confidence wavered. He glanced at Grandpa repeatedly, the tremor in his voice betraying his unease. Grandpa's gaze met his for a fraction of a second, steady, calm, unyielding. It was a silent assertion that dignity could not be commanded by words alone. It existed in presence, in the way one held oneself against the currents of judgment and bias. A cluster of men in tailored suits whispered among themselves, eyes flicking nervously toward Grandpa. One of them cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure, but the weight of his own arrogance was crumbling subtly. Grandpa did not speak. He did not need to. His mere presence, the composed strength in his posture and movement, carried more authority than any argument they could muster. The children in the congregation, watching quietly from the pews, felt the shift instinctively. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, whispering, "Mom, why is he standing there like that?" She shushed him, yet her eyes betrayed her awareness. Even the youngest innocent observers could sense the tension, the quiet challenge to the social rules that had gone unquestioned for generations. Grandpa's hand rested on the edge of his cane, fingers tracing the worn handle, a tactile reminder of decades lived with grace and resilience. Every subtle movement, the adjustment of his coat, the slight tilt of his head, the careful placement of each step was laden with purpose. He communicated strength without aggression, patience without passivity, and dignity that demanded acknowledgement without seeking it. The murmurs softened, replaced by uneasy glances and restrained body language. A few attendees shifted in their seats, attempting to regain the authority they felt slipping away. Others avoided eye contact, unsure how to process the quiet defiance that radiated from this single figure at the front of the chapel. The balance of power had subtly tilted, and everyone sensed it, even if they could not articulate it. Grandpa lifted his head, eyes scanning the chapel one more time. Every whisper, every doubtful glance, Every awkward adjustment of posture fed into the cinematic rhythm of the moment. The room seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the inevitable confrontation between arrogance and dignity to unfold. As the preacher finished the next verse, a hush fell over the congregation. Grandpa's presence had altered the room's atmosphere. The whispers were no longer mere judgment. They were recognition, acknowledgement, and subtle unease. The arrogance that had once seemed unshakable now wavered, and the first threads of doubt began to unravel among those who had assumed unquestioned superiority. In that stillness, Grandpa's calm remained unbroken. Every glance cast at him, every whisper in his direction, reinforced the contrast between his quiet dignity and the fragile, crumbling arrogance surrounding him. The stage was being set for the revelation that would soon make the chapel tremble, a culmination of tension, judgment, and the undeniable force of character. The chapel seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension, a subtle energy that crawled along the polished wooden pews and the flickering candlelight. Every glance cast toward Grandpa carried layers of curiosity, discomfort, and the first stirrings of doubt. The murmurs, once covert, now threaded through the congregation like an electric current, tense and vibrating with anticipation. Grandpa stood at the front, his cane lightly tapping the floor with a deliberate rhythm. His posture was impeccable, straight-backed, composed, eyes calm yet piercing. Each movement, measured and confident, made the room's silent observers acutely aware of the contrast between his dignity and the fragile arrogance surrounding him. The young usher, positioned near the side aisle, shifted nervously, unsure how to manage the delicate energy that seemed to radiate from the older man. A woman in the back row clutched her lace gloves tightly, whispering to her companion, I don't understand. He shouldn't even be here." Her friend shook her head slightly, her voice barely audible. "Just let it be." Both were unconsciously drawn into the gravity of Grandpa's presence, their whispered indignation slowly giving way to a creeping sense of unease. Grandpa adjusted his coat, letting the fabric fall neatly over his shoulders. His hand hovered lightly over the cane, a subtle statement of readiness, of composed strength. Every shift of his weight, every small gesture, conveyed control not through aggression, but through an unwavering assertion of self-worth. The congregation felt it. The arrogance that had seemed absolute at the start of the service now wavered under the quiet power emanating from him. The preacher's voice faltered mid-verse, a slight tremor betraying the growing anxiety in his words. He glanced at Grandpa repeatedly, eyes narrowing, unsure how to navigate the invisible force this man represented. The carefully maintained order of the chapel was beginning to fracture subtly, unnoticed by some, yet painfully apparent to those attuned to human tension. A small group of men in tailored suits exchanged glances, unease written on their faces. Their whispered assurances to one another were hollow, lacking conviction. Grandpa did not speak to them, did not need to. His calm demeanor alone undermined the hierarchy they relied upon, exposing their authority as contingent and fragile. The children, seated nearby, watched with wide eyes, sensing the unspoken dynamics and absorbing lessons of dignity that surpassed anything taught in words. Grandpa reached into his pocket and unfolded a small, worn handkerchief, letting it rest lightly in his hand. It was a small, deliberate act that drew subtle attention, emphasizing his composed poise and the deliberate care with which he presented himself. Every flicker of candlelight seemed to highlight the texture of the fabric, the motion of his fingers, and the quiet force of his presence. It was not grandiose. It was understated, yet undeniably commanding. The murmurs softened again, replaced by tight-lipped expressions and nervous glances. A woman near the front adjusted her posture, as if preparing for a confrontation that would never come. A man shifted in his seat, jaw tightening, eyes flicking between Grandpa and the preacher. Even the most confident members of the congregation felt the weight of a presence that could not be diminished by social expectation. Alone, Grandpa's gaze swept across the room, noting every glance, every whisper, every subtle shift in posture. His calm resilience acted as a mirror, reflecting the fragility of arrogance back onto those who had assumed unquestioned superiority. The chapel, filled with polished wood and floral arrangements, seemed to acknowledge his presence, the air thick with anticipation for the moment when quiet dignity would confront entitlement in a revelation that no one could ignore. The hymn resumed, soft and deliberate. Grandpa joined in, low and steady, blending with the voices around him. His tone, gentle yet distinct, reinforced the presence that had begun to unsettle the room. The arrogance that had once dominated subtly trembled. Even without confrontation, Grandpa's mere existence in the space challenged assumptions, exposing the instability beneath the surface. As the service continued, every whispered judgment, every nervous glance, every stiff posture contributed to the mounting tension. Grandpa remained composed, seated near the front, eyes calm, aura unyielding. The stage was set. The whispers, the stares, the unease, they were threads weaving a larger tapestry that was about to unravel. Every breath, every movement, every quiet gesture was a step toward the revelation that would make the entire chapel tremble. The atmosphere in the chapel had shifted, imperceptibly at first, then with undeniable weight. The polished wooden pews reflected more than candlelight. They mirrored the growing discomfort of the congregation. Every whispered comment, every sideways glance, now carried the undercurrent of self-doubt. Grandpa stood near the front, steady as ever, his cane lightly tapping the floor in a rhythmic cadence that seemed to command attention without demand. A young woman, her fingers intertwined in her lap, stole glances at him repeatedly. Her breath caught as she noticed the quiet authority he carried. He did not speak. He did not need to. The subtle curve of his shoulders, the precise movements of his hands, the calm lift of his chin, everything about him communicated an unwavering dignity that unsettled the room. Near the aisle, a man in a tailored suit shifted nervously, adjusting his tie, attempting to regain composure. Yet each glance toward Grandpa seemed to drain a bit of confidence from him, leaving a visible tremor in his posture. The man's whispered conversation with his neighbor faltered mid-sentence as if the words themselves were afraid to challenge the silent force radiating from the front of the chapel. Grandpa's eyes moved across the congregation, observing each subtle reaction. The murmurs, once audacious, had quieted into restrained tension. A mother gently hushed her child, her own lips tight, as though uncertain what lesson she was silently imparting. The children sensed the shift instinctively, wide-eyed, absorbing the dynamic between calm dignity and fragile arrogance. He lifted his hand slightly, brushing the sleeve of his coat. The gesture was small, deliberate, yet it resonated through the room, punctuating the fragile hierarchy that was beginning to crumble. The polished floors, the flickering candlelight, the subtle scents of flowers and wax, all seemed to participate in the silent theater, highlighting every anxious shift, every hesitant glance. The preacher's voice faltered again, softening mid-verse. His eyes flicked toward Grandpa, hesitation threading through his tone. The authority he once assumed so confidently had begun to erode under the weight of a presence that demanded acknowledgement without confrontation. The congregation's whispered judgments, their subtle displays of superiority, now trembled like brittle glass, ready to shatter. A small group of women exchanged uneasy glances. One whispered, "It's unsettling. How calm he is." Another nodded, eyes wide, adjusting her posture nervously. Grandpa's calmness, his composed presence, was a mirror reflecting not just dignity, but the fragility of the arrogance surrounding him. He did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to confront anyone. His very existence was enough to reveal the cracks. Grandpa reached into his pocket and withdrew the worn handkerchief again, letting it rest in his palm. The simple act seemed almost ceremonial, a quiet demonstration of control, of composure, of history lived fully and with honor. Eyes followed the movement, some with curiosity, some with a rising sense of unease, all recognizing perhaps subconsciously the power inherent in restraint and dignity. The murmurs began to shift in tone, some hesitant, some questioning. The children observed silently, learning without words. The young usher, standing awkwardly near the side aisle, glanced at Grandpa with an expression that mingled confusion and admiration. Even in this quiet corner of the chapel, the influence of Grandpa's presence was evident. The preacher, now visibly unsettled, tried to regain rhythm in his sermon, but every word was tinged with uncertainty. Grandpa's calm gaze, his subtle gestures, and unyielding posture held the room's attention, quietly undermining the superficial authority that had once seemed absolute. The congregation's arrogance now trembled, fractured in the presence of dignity that could not be shaken by social expectation. By the time the hymn resumed, the energy in the chapel had transformed. Where once whispers and judgment had dominated, there was now tension, curiosity, and an undercurrent of unease. Grandpa's presence acted as a catalyst, slowly dissolving the invisible walls of entitlement, revealing the fragility beneath the confident facades. Every glance cast in his direction, every hesitant movement, every whispered exchange was part of the silent narrative building toward revelation. Grandpa remained composed, seated near the front, aura calm, presence undeniable. The stage was almost fully set, the cracks in confidence widening with each passing moment, preparing the room for the revelation that would leave everyone trembling. The chapel air had grown heavy, charged with the weight of unspoken conflict. Every whispered comment and sideways glance was laced with growing uncertainty. Grandpa remained near the front, his cane resting lightly against his knee, hands folded with deliberate precision. Candlelight danced across the polished pews, reflecting the faces of those who had underestimated him, faces now painted with discomfort and disbelief. A woman near the back pressed her palms against her knees, leaning slightly forward as if to steady herself. Her whispered conversation with a companion faltered. I don't know what to say. Her voice trailed, swallowed by the tension that had spread like a silent contagion through the room. The companion shook her head slightly, acknowledging the same uncertainty she could not articulate. Grandpa's calm presence was unyielding, yet it was a force the entire congregation felt pressing upon them. The preacher cleared his throat, attempting to regain composure, but his voice wavered. He glanced repeatedly at Grandpa, eyes narrowing, a flicker of fear crossing his face. The carefully orchestrated ceremony, once predictable and orderly, now seemed fragile, almost brittle, under the quiet authority of a single man. Every sentence he spoke was punctuated by an awareness of the room's shifting dynamics, and every hesitation betrayed the growing realization that control was slipping. Grandpa's gaze swept across the congregation, steady, observant, unyielding. Every whispered remark, every nervous movement, every averted glance seemed to be catalogued in the stillness of his mind. He did not react outwardly. He did not need to. His presence alone dismantled assumptions and exposed the fragility of arrogance, revealing cracks in the social hierarchy that had been assumed uncheckable. A young boy, seated near the center, whispered to his mother, "Why is he different?" The mother's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her grip, shushing him softly but unable to hide her own curiosity. Even the youngest observers sensed the tension and the quiet strength emanating from Grandpa. They could feel the shift happening, a subtle yet powerful lesson in dignity and presence that would leave a lasting impression. Grandpa's hand rested lightly on his cane, fingers brushing the worn handle. He made a small, deliberate movement, unfolding his handkerchief and letting it rest in his palm. The gesture was quiet, almost ceremonial, yet it commanded attention. Every eye in the room caught the motion, and for a brief moment, even the whispers seemed to pause, replaced by a collective awareness of his presence, his dignity, and the unspoken power he carried. The murmurs began again, this time tinged with a mixture of awe and confusion. Faces that had once carried arrogance now betrayed unease, uncertainty, and a hint of guilt. Some shifted in their seats, unable to reconcile their assumptions with the reality before them. Others avoided eye contact entirely, feeling exposed by the quiet authority that radiated from Grandpa. Grandpa adjusted his coat, the movement fluid, deliberate, commanding without confrontation. He remained composed, a stark contrast to the unease he had elicited. The polished floors, the flickering candlelight, and the subtle scent of flowers framed the moment, creating a cinematic tableau of dignity and tension. The congregation's whispers and glances had become part of a silent narrative, a story of power, arrogance, and inevitable reckoning. The preacher attempted to continue, but his words faltered and a visible tremor ran through his hands. The subtle authority of the room had shifted, the balance of power quietly but unmistakably tilting. Every person in attendance felt it. The arrogance that had once seemed absolute now teetered on the edge, weakened by the quiet force of presence and dignity before them. Grandpa's gaze met several in the crowd, lingering briefly. There was no anger, no aggression, only the calm assurance of a man who had endured, observed, and now silently commanded respect. The whispers, the sideways glances, the unease, all were threads in a tensioned web, preparing the room for a revelation that would ripple through every pew and shake the carefully constructed assumptions of entitlement. By the hymn's end, the stage was fully set. The congregation's unease had crystallized into visible reactions, shifting feet, tightened grips, averted eyes, subtle nods of recognition. Grandpa remained composed, calm, and unyielding. The moment of revelation was imminent, and every glance, every whispered word, every anxious movement contributed to the growing anticipation of what was about to unfold. The chapel was nearly silent now, the air electric with anticipation. Every whisper, every glance, every shift in posture had built toward this final moment. Grandpa remained near the front, seated calmly, hands lightly resting on his cane. Candlelight flickered across the polished wood, illuminating the anxious faces of the congregation. The murmurs that had once flowed like an undercurrent had slowed, replaced by tense, watchful silence. The preacher cleared his throat, trying to regain control, his voice steady but edged with uncertainty. We will now honor the deceased," he began, pausing mid-sentence as his gaze fell upon Grandpa. The congregation, previously brimming with judgment, stiffened. Eyes widened, jaws tightened, and a few whispered nervously among themselves. There was a palpable shift, a tension that no one could ignore. Grandpa rose slowly, cane tapping rhythmically against the polished floor. Each step was deliberate, measured, carrying decades of dignity. The chapel seemed to shrink around him, as if the walls themselves leaned in to witness the unfolding truth. Every eye was on him now, some with curiosity, others with apprehension, all with growing anticipation. A hush fell as he reached the pulpit. The preacher stepped back slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Grandpa's voice, calm and resonant, broke the silence. "I am here not just as a mourner, but as the father of the man we honor today." The words echoed through the room, carrying weight, authority, and the undeniable power of truth. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Eyes darted between Grandpa and the preacher, disbelief etched across every face. The arrogance that had held the room captive began to crumble visibly. A woman clutched her chest, whispering, "It can't be." A man's jaw dropped, and he turned to his companion, unable to speak. The quiet dignity of Grandpa had become an unstoppable force, revealing the hypocrisy and entitlement that had once seemed untouchable. Grandpa continued, voice steady, unwavering. "For years, assumptions and whispers have followed me. Judgments made without knowledge, without understanding. Today, all of that changes." His calm authority filled the room, silencing even the most stubborn murmurs. The children, wide-eyed, leaned forward slightly, sensing the weight of history and dignity in the moment. The preacher, now visibly shaken, stepped aside, allowing Grandpa to address the congregation fully. Every whispered judgment, every sideways glance, every sign of arrogance was met with a presence that could not be diminished. Grandpa's composed demeanor contrasted sharply with the crumbling confidence of those who had assumed superiority. The room was transformed, tension replaced with awe, disbelief replaced with recognition. Grandpa gestured toward the front pew where the deceased lay in honor. "The man we mourn today was my son," he declared, his voice carrying both pride and quiet sorrow. The congregation reeled. Every assumption made in the previous hours shattered in that single revelation. Faces paled, whispers ceased, and the invisible hierarchy that had once dominated the room collapsed completely. Tears welled in the eyes of some, not for grief alone, but for the humility that had finally been demanded of them. Arrogance had no place here. Dignity, patience, and quiet strength held the stage. Grandpa's calm, unwavering presence had demonstrated that respect was earned through character, not inherited entitlement. As the congregation processed the revelation, Grandpa's gaze swept across the room once more. There was no anger, no demand for apology, only a quiet assertion of truth and dignity. The finality of the moment pressed into every heart. Assumptions based on appearance or status could not withstand the weight of integrity and presence. Children whispered softly to one another, learning without words. Adults shifted, some nodding slowly, others still processing the gravity of the moment. The chapel, filled with polished wood, flickering candlelight, and floral fragrance, seemed to breathe in unison with the truth revealed. Grandpa, seated once more near the front, cane in hand, radiated calm triumph, the embodiment of quiet revolution and poetic justice. The preacher cleared his throat, voice small now, acknowledging the magnitude of the revelation. There were no speeches of reprimand, no dramatic confrontations, only the undeniable clarity that dignity had prevailed, arrogance had fallen, and respect had been restored. Every whispered judgment, every glance of doubt, had been met and transcended by a quiet, unshakable force. As the final hymn played, Grandpa joined in, low and steady, his voice blending with the congregation. Each note resonated through the chapel, carrying with it the weight of history, resilience, and the enduring power of character. The room, once tense and judgmental, now vibrated with quiet reflection, awe, and respect. In that moment, the narrative had shifted completely. Whispers of arrogance gave way to recognition of dignity. Silent judgments dissolved into acknowledgement of truth. The chapel, once a theater of entitlement, had become a stage for justice, resilience, and the quiet triumph of character over assumption. Grandpa remained composed, a calm force at the heart of the revelation. As the echoes of the truth resonated through every pew, every candlelight, every gaze, the room trembled not with fear, but with understanding. The story, once tense and uncertain, had found its resolution. Dignity had triumphed, and the lessons would linger far beyond the closing of the chapel doors.